New Chicago Bears defensive lineman Rasheem Green has a lot of upside as a young free agent signing. But he wasn't one of the big-name free agents that Bears fans wanted the team to sign. And I don't think he's good enough to keep them from signing another one down the line or using their draft picks early and often on the defensive line.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on the show today, we're breaking down the newest Bears defensive lineman, Rasheem Green, signed from the Houston Texans and the Seattle Seahawks are his two stops in the NFL. We'll look at where he fits on this Bears defensive line and what he brings. We'll look at why the Bears signed him and not the bigger names that I think Bears fans are clamoring for. You know, Frank Clark, Yannick Ngakoue, somebody with some experience and some consistent proven production at a position of major need for the Chicago Bears. And we'll wrap up at looking at how this might affect their plans in the NFL draft and why it really shouldn't have too much impact, but what that could still look like, how he might fit with other defensive linemen the Bears could still add via that route. It's been a while since the Bears have made a free agent signing, despite having a ton of cap space throughout this process, but they go out and add a guy like Rasheem Green who fits this kind of mold that we looked at them approaching in free agency this year. They have not really gone after older free agent prospects. It's tended to be young guys with still some of their best play ahead of them and really trying not to overspend on anybody not named Tremaine Edmonds up to this point. And Green really fits that bill. He's currently 25, turns 26 next month. He's been in the league 4 or 5 seasons, but was young coming into the NFL and played some of his best football this past season with the Houston Texans. I still don't think he was great, but a guy that maybe is getting better and is well worth, I think, a 1-year flyer type contract as it appears. I don't believe we have the full details yet as I'm recording this, but it doesn't appear like it's going to be anything, expensive or long-term given the time of the year in April here when he is signing this contract. But he was a 3rd-round pick by the Seahawks out of USC back in 2018. Was a rotational guy at first, started a little bit on and off for them and was never really great, right? Never took that next step forward that I think the Seahawks were looking for him to take. And certainly, scheme-wise, he seemed to be a good fit in what they wanted. He fit the mold of a Seahawks defensive lineman where he's tall and long and almost sort of a tweener. He's at that 275-pound range where he's definitely kind of light enough to play the edge, but kind of heavy enough to play the 3 technique spot, and definitely plays a lot of that 5 technique defensive end, the Akeem Hicks role in the 3-4 defense that the Seahawks under Pete Carroll have often asked their linemen to play. They play the sort of the 4-3 over, where they shift a lineman over and bring a linebacker down, so it's closer to a 5-2 of sorts, but not exactly, and he can kind of play that hybrid defensive end role. And there's some similarities there in that regard to DeMarcus Walker, who the Chicago Bears signed from the Tennessee Titans earlier this offseason. Another guy who had spent 1 year on a new team and had a pretty good year with that new team, and then sort of cashed in a little bit more so in free agency to jump to another team after that 1 year of improved production. You look at Rasheem Green, his sack numbers went down this past season in Houston, so it doesn't jump out at you right away as somebody who had a great year in Houston, and great would be too strong of a word. He had 6.5 sacks in 2021 in Seattle, 3.5 sacks this past season in Houston. But what the difference was, in Seattle, his last season, he started 16 games. In Houston, he was coming off the bench and more of a rotational player. He went from 850 snaps the year before to about 550 snaps in Houston. So a decrease in snaps, it just is a decrease in opportunities to rush the passer, and therefore a decrease in opportunities to generate more sacks. But year to year, from 2021 when he had all the sacks to 2022 when he didn't, he improved his pass rush win rate, which we've talked about before on this podcast about DeMarcus Walker and others. I'd look at Pro Football Focus's pass rush win rate as opposed to ESPN's, which is a far inferior measurement. The PFF pass rush win rate is based on, okay, on any individual play, how often did you beat the blocker in front of you? It doesn't mean you got a pressure or a hit or a sack, but just beat your blocker. Because sometimes you beat your offensive lineman and right as the quarterback is getting rid of the ball, so you never get the pressure, the hit, or the sack, but you did win your pass rush. Whereas ESPN's pass rush win rate is a proximity. How close did you get to the quarterback on the play? So you don't even have to actually win your block. You just have to be within a certain amount of distance from the quarterback, which is not a good way of measuring how well a pass rusher performed. But he improved his pass rush win rate, was generally generating pressure at a higher percentage, about 10%, generated pressure at a higher rate than Trevis Gibson did last season. So if not by a ton, but that's a comparison there. He actually generated a higher pass rush win rate than Yannick Ngakoue. Just had 9 fewer sacks or whatever it was in 2022 specifically alone. He also cut down on his rate of missed tackles, which was a little bit high, and increased his rate of run stops. I think he was better overall in run defense in Houston. And I think part of that too is just what those two defenses were asking him to do. I think in Seattle, it wasn't necessarily as much of a, one gap type of shooting penetration up the middle. Like he was in Lovie Smith's defense in Houston where he could be a little bit more of that. He played actually quite a bit, mostly on the edge rusher position, whereas in Seattle, it was more like the 5 technique and a little bit more towards the interior. So you're not pinning your ears back as much. You're facing a lot more double teams at that spot. And so it's impressive that he had as many sacks as he did. But I think that's the reason why you see the pass rush win rate and pressure rate improve heading into Houston into more of a Lovie Smith style of scheme that matches a lot more closely to what the Bears are going to run with Matt Eberflus. So I think there's a lot to like about Green as a 26-year-old with a lot of upside who's coming on a cheap 1-year deal. He's not a guy that I think you look at him and say, all right, he's locked in. He's your starter at one of the defensive end spots. You're good to go. To me, he's a rotational guy that can play a lot of snaps, but maybe not. You're not in love with him as like your number one option by any means. Maybe if you have him and Gibson kind of split one of the starting roles a little bit, you can get by with that. But if you're going to do that, you need a really, really strong option as the other defensive end opposite him. Green to me and Gibson both seem like really good number 3 options at defensive end. If you have 2 starters ahead of them that are better, those are both good number 3s, but I guess 2 number 3s can kind of combine to be a borderline number 2. But I think a lot of Bears fans are looking around saying, okay, they signed Rasheem Green, but why are they signing him and not Jadeveon Clowney, Yannick Ngakoue, Frank Clark? There's a lot of free agent quality veterans that are more household names with more proven production. They're still sitting there on the free agent market. So we'll dive a little closer into how these dynamics play in free agency and why a guy like Rasheem Green is signed now while some of those other guys sit unsigned. Next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at Ultimate Pro Football GM. You've heard us talk about this free mobile game a few times here on the podcast, and if you've ever thought you'd make a good GM, then you got to give this a try because it's not as easy as you might think to create a dynasty. When you play Ultimate Football GM, you get complete control over every strategic aspect of your team as you play through seasons and try and lead them to glory. You're controlling free agent signings. You can sign cheap defensive linemen like Rasheem Green. You can sign expensive defensive linemen like Jadeveon Clowney or whoever. You make the draft picks. You make draft pick trades, player trades. You set lineups. You hire and fire coaches and scouts and front office people, all in a realistic and challenging game world. Trust me, I've not been able to win a Super Bowl yet on Ultimate Pro Football GM, but I'm getting to the playoffs pretty consistently, and I feel like that's just the right amount of difficulty for me. All free and playable offline. Right now, Locked On Bears listeners will get a 100% free boost to your franchise when you use our promo code Locked On, all caps, in the game's store. That's Locked On in all caps. So make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on your app store. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Rasheem Green is coming off a season with 3.5 sacks. He had 6.5 sacks the year before. He's far from the cream of the crop of current available free agent defensive linemen. Free agents at arguably the biggest position of need across the board on this Bears roster. You're looking around saying Yannick Ngakoue is a double-digit sack guy. Frank Clark has been a double-digit sack guy and still has that kind of potential within him. Even, Jadeveon Clowney, Leonard Floyd, a former Bear, is out there. It starts to get a little bit older when you get into like Melvin Ingram, Justin Houston type free agent options that maybe are a little bit older than what the Bears might want. But we're kind of also at this point where it's like, you got the cap space. You're not signing these guys to long-term contracts at this stage. So why not pay up a little bit and, sign Clowney to a 1-year, $10-12 million deal, or sign Ngakoue to whatever that might look like for him. Ngakoue's a little bit on the younger side compared to some of these other guys. Why aren't they making these deals right now? Why are they signing Rasheem Green instead when there are clearly better options out there on the free agent market? And what it comes down to is not perhaps, we don't know exactly what the Bears' interest is in those players, but more so I think the ball is in the camps of Ngakoue and Clowney and all of those guys, and they're willing to wait. They're the ones that seem more willing to sit this process out a little bit longer, and they're the ones who might be more inclined to wait until after the draft. That's not to say if a team like the Bears threw a bunch of money at them, they would certainly sign it today. It's not that they wouldn't accept any deal. Like, you could always pay them enough to make them agree to sign the contract. But of course, the Bears want to be smart about their money and don't just want to hand a blank check to Jadeveon Clowney or whatever name, pick your name on the free agent list. They're going to value them at a certain amount, and perhaps that's more or less than that player might value themselves or be willing to accept to play. And so the Bears aren't going to just budge and spend whatever it takes to fill that spot. And these players are going to look around and say, okay, listen, the first big waves of free agency are over, right? Everyone who's signing now, it's kind of like little 1-year deal, Rasheem Green type signings to fill holes and to fill depth and to get some either backup or rotational options here. And teams are in draft mode, right? They said, okay, we kind of spent our money to fill some of the big holes in free agency. Now let's see how this draft is going to go. And then after the draft, depending on what they do or don't get with their draft picks, that's when you come back to this sort of like late stage third wave of free agency after the draft, where you start to see some of these more veteran players sign. Because from the player perspective as well, they kind of want to look around and say, okay, well, what are the Bears going to do? Are the Bears going to draft a defensive end in the first round, and all of a sudden, am I going to have less playing time? Or also, not even about playing time, but are the Bears going to draft enough good players that I can look at that roster and say, hey, they're going to compete for the playoffs in a Super Bowl this year? Or if I keep using Clowney because it's kind of the top name, but pick your poison, Frank Clark, whoever. If I'm Frank Clark, if I'm Jadeveon Clowney, and I'm looking and saying like, okay, I want to go to a team that's going to give me the best chance late in my career to try and win a Super Bowl ring. And on April 6th, right now, as I'm recording this podcast, the Bears are not the best team to give those guys a chance to win a Super Bowl ring, right? They're certainly weighing different motivations because they're going to want a certain amount of money. If they just wanted a Super Bowl ring, they could sign a 1-year veteran minimum deal with the Chiefs or the Eagles or whatever and just play. Like, it's where can I make the most money while still having a good chance to win the Super Bowl? And right now, the Bears are not that team. The Bears are not a Super Bowl favorite in 2023. I'm willing to accept arguments as to why they could push for the playoffs this year. Absolutely, especially depending on what goes on with the NFL draft. They can fill a few holes and get the right players. This could be a sneaky playoff team. We'll have plenty of time this offseason to discuss those possibilities. That's not what I'm here to argue today. But the point is, Clark and Clowney and some of these other guys have some of these competing motivations. And if they look in the draft and say, okay, like the Eagles got better here, and here, and I really feel like they've got a good chance to make the Super Bowl again this year, I'm going to go sign there to play on that defensive line and thrive. Even if maybe it's a little bit less money than the Bears or other teams were offering me, like I want to see how these draft picks go to fill some of these team holes. And then they can get a better sense of what the teams might be able to offer them in terms of opportunity. And then the teams will have a better sense of how desperate they are to sign these players, right? If the Bears draft an offensive tackle in the first round and maybe, you go cornerback and center in the second round and, you don't end up getting a defensive lineman until the third or fourth or fifth round, all of a sudden the Bears might leave the draft going, okay, we didn't want to reach on a defensive lineman, but we still really need one. So we'll go to Jadeveon Clowney or Frank Clark or Leonard Floyd or whoever and say, or Ngakoue and say, okay, listen, we were offering you $10 million before. How about 12? All of a sudden the market dynamics change as far as which teams need what and how desperate they will be. Because right now the Bears could say, okay, we might be able to get Tyree Wilson or Lucas Van Ness or, pick your defensive end or in the second round, guys like Keon White from Georgia Tech. Like, we might be able to get that guy in the first or second round, and maybe we don't need to go out and pay an older veteran player a lot of money to be here for really just 1 year. We'd rather have young guys that we can grow and develop into these roles, like Rasheem Green, who's on a 1-year deal, but a young player who you might consider bringing back as a long-term piece if he plays well. But if we can get a good defensive end or two and a good defensive tackle or two in the draft, well, then maybe we don't need to go sign Jadeveon Clowney or Frank Clark, and we can just be happy with the young guys that we have, develop, and not be so worried about making sure we got to spend big bucks on them. So there really is sort of a two-way street of competing interests, and that's what the NFL draft has to sort out for not only the teams like the Bears, but also the free agent players as they evaluate what their options are. I'm sure Ngakoue and Clark and Clowney and others have all gotten offers from teams. It's not like no one's talking. It's just, unless you want to come back and offer me more, let's put a pause on these negotiations a little bit until we get closer to draft day or until we get after the draft and after undrafted free agent signings. It's why the Bears waited and signed Riley Reiff and Michael Schofield last season after the draft. Despite having needs and holes on the offensive line to add more of those players in there, they waited till after the draft, gave Riley Reiff quite a bit of money on a 1-year deal. I would expect that's a very real possibility for the defensive line and potentially the offensive line as well, again, depending on how things go in the NFL draft. That's the other side of this. Rasheem Green signing from the Texans certainly gives the Bears more depth and more rotational value at a massive position of need, but I don't think it should drastically affect their plans in the NFL draft. We'll kind of look at how his versatility and DeMarcus Walker's versatility, the versatility of this whole defensive line right now, might shape the defensive line decisions the Bears make in the draft next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. It's basically bet insurance that no matter what on your first bet, if it goes wrong and your bet is incorrect, they will give you up to $1,000 back in bonus bets. So you can't be wrong. You're guaranteed to have a win. You either get the bet right or they give you money back for your bet. And you can bet on, for example, the NFL draft, on who's going to be the first, second, or third pick, who's going to be the first wide receiver, the first offensive lineman, the first defensive player drafted, et cetera, et cetera. You could bet on the NBA playoffs right around the corner and so much more. FanDuel is going to be a great opportunity to have a safe bet on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use because you're going to get that no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets. Don't miss out on your chance. Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL and NBA. Rasheem Green will add an important piece to this Bears defensive line rotation. They needed the depth, absolutely. But he is not, I don't think he in any way should affect how they approach the defensive line in the NFL draft. It is far too big of a need on this roster. We know we're sort of expecting DeMarcus Walker to play a little bit more interior 3-technique defensive lineman than edge rusher, but he can play both. And I'm expecting Rasheem Green to play a little bit more edge rusher defensive line than 3-technique defensive tackle. But he too can play both. And I think Ryan Poles is being very intentional about signing both of these players that are bigger, longer defensive linemen with positional versatility. Because all of a sudden, I guess if you go through the draft and if you don't get any defensive ends, you could, in theory, play DeMarcus Walker and Rasheem Green as your 2 top defensive ends, Travis Gibson as your 3, Dominique Robinson as your 4. I think that's still a very weak defensive end group, and I would still try and sign Jadeveon Clowney, Frank Clark, Yannick Ngakoue, etc., to bolster that group because you can never have too many good pass rushers. But, that's a little bit more manageable if they draft, say, Jalen Carter at 9 or Kalijah Cansey at 9, or they get, Keanu Benton in the second round. You get a couple of defensive tackles in there. You have the versatility to put Walker and Green, potentially, both at the edge rusher position if you want or need to. To me, it kind of mirrors what we've been talking about with like Tevin Jenkins on the offensive line. It's like Jenkins is a really good guard we saw, but you could play him at offensive tackle if you're not able to get an offensive tackle. Or if you get a tackle, then you can put Jenkins at guard. I think Green and Walker both offer basically that type of, I don't want to say that level of versatility because we've seen Jenkins be great at guard and pretty good at offensive tackle. And I don't know that Walker or Green are as good at either position as Jenkins is at guard personally. But still, you look at the inverse, right? Maybe the Bears get somehow Tyree Wilson makes it to the 9th overall pick, or they take, the Clemson edge rusher whose name, or Nolan Smith from Georgia, but the Clemson, I keep thinking Brian Bresee. I get the two Clemson guys mixed up. The Clemson edge rusher, as I sort of talk my way through this and try and scroll quickly, Miles Murphy. I know I just had him on a list earlier today. Maybe they get Miles Murphy at 9 or one of the other edge rushers, and then later on in the draft, you get a second edge rusher because you can never have too many. And then you go in and say, okay, we've got young quality edge rushers as the starters, and you can throw Walker and Green on the interior and let them both rush as interior guys and feel like, okay, you've got the depth at either spot. So that's why I feel like Green and Walker should not affect the Bears draft plans in any way. Just because you might see one as an edge or one as a defensive tackle does not mean like, okay, that means we got to draft a defensive tackle because Walker and Green are both edge rushers. Or we got to draft an edge rusher because Walker and Green are both defensive tackles. To me, I think the Bears are going to approach this with a really open mind and say, yep, these guys can play either spot potentially, so let's just get the best player available. And if that's an edge rusher, great. If that's a defensive tackle, also great. And I like that flexibility approach from Ryan Poles. I wish I had a little bit more confidence in those two players, Walker and Green. I don't think they're going to be terrible by any means, but neither one strikes me as like, oh yeah, like we got our guy. This guy is going to be great, sure thing, really going to dominate the NFL. They're both guys with upside, and I certainly value upside. The wild card in this that I think would be most interesting is if the Bears draft Lucas Van Ness from Iowa. There was a reason I didn't mention him in any of the names I said yet, because he's also this exact kind of guy. He's like 6'4", 6'5", about 270, 275 pounds, just like Walker and Green. And like Walker and Green, this past season, I'm getting the order mixed up. He spent 1 year at the 3-technique defensive tackle and 1 year at the defensive end spot. I think this past season was defensive end, 2 years ago, defensive tackle. So he can play both and has played both at a very high level. And imagine you draft him in the first round, whether it's at 9 or even trading down a few spots. And now all of a sudden you have 3 guys that you like that can play edge and can play defensive tackle. And maybe all of a sudden that way you go into free agency afterward. This, again, like this sort of post-draft veteran free agency. And you can look around and say, okay, we could go after and sign a guy like Ngakoue to play like the outside spot, or Frank Clark to play the outside spot. Or maybe we could go after a defensive tackle like a Ashawn Robinson or a Poona Ford, or even, Akeem Hicks, I think might still be out there. Chris Wormley. Like there's some interior guys as well that maybe aren't quite the level of household name, but then all of a sudden you're not hamstrung to say, man, we didn't get a defensive end. We got to go get one in free agency and pay top dollar. You just have flexibility across the board. And I think it'd be a lot of fun to imagine the different defensive line lineups where you could come out in the field with Van Ness, Green, Walker, and even Justin Jones last year played some edge and played some 3-technique. You could have 4 guys on the lineup there that could line up anywhere on the defensive line. And so then opposing offensive linemen, you can change the order up and down however you want, and all those guys become a little bit more amorphous. All of them are bigger, stronger guys in terms of the running game and being able to occupy blocks to free up TJ Edwards and Tremaine Edmonds. And all of a sudden, like, there's some fun tools you get to play with there, even though I still think the Bears need better. They need more. They need a bigger name, a more marquee pass rush help, because it's still not a very strong group up front. Still need to see them make defensive line a bigger priority in some way, shape, or form through the draft and post-draft free agency. You can be sure any and all defensive line moves they make, we're going to break down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thank you for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen and you like this team building, team construction talk here that we do about the Bears, go check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs, because that's what they do across the league. They look at the NFL teams from a team building perspective, salary cap, free agency, the draft, trades, and how rosters are constructed in the most effective ways for success. So go check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast for your second listen today. Coming back on Monday for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity for you to bear down.